Why is it that this image looks worse than this image? Or that this image looks more pleasing than this one? It all comes down to a bunch of lines. These lines, the thirds grid. Let me explain how to use it. My name is Josh Berman, I'm a wedding photographer and videographer, and I want to explain how the rule of thirds works and how you can apply it to your own photography. You may have heard of the rule of thirds, or a thirds grid, before. A thirds grid is a 3x3 grid that you overlay on top of your image. This grid divides the image up into 3 vertical columns and 3 horizontal rows. The rule of thirds takes that 3x3 grid and uses it as a guide for how to frame your photos. Essentially, the rule states that your subject should always be placed on one of the vertical lines, and the intersection of 2 lines are especially ideal spots. Luckily, just about every camera nowadays has an option to enable a thirds grid. On the Canon R6, for example, this setting can be found under the red camera section, tab 7, shooting info display, grid display. iPhones also have a thirds grid that you can turn on. In the settings app, go down to camera and toggle on the grid option. Even Lightroom has an option for a thirds grid. Go up to Tools and select Crop Guide Overlay, where you can choose a thirds grid from the options listed. You can also cycle through the grid options by pressing the O key. Following the rule of thirds will overall just make your images look more pleasing, but here are a few specific examples. When shooting a subject like a person, place the subject in either the left or the right third so that you've got 1/3 of the image behind the subject and 2/3 of the image in front of them. Also ensure that their head lands on the intersection of 2 lines. This gives the subject looking room to look into the rest of the image. This shot from the Queen's Gambit is a great example. You've got the subject of the frame positioned in the right third of the image looking into the rest of the frame, and their head is situated very close to that top right intersection. And on the other side of the image, you've got the telephone sitting on the bottom left intersection. So not only is the subject in one of the thirds, you've also got the telephone on the other third balancing out the image. The rule of thirds also applies to landscape shots where there isn't necessarily a super defined subject. Placing the horizon line of the landscape in either the bottom third or the top third will give you a much more interesting image. This photo, for example, is way more interesting framed with the mountain range on the bottom third rather than in the center. If I zoom in and center the mountains, I feel like it loses some of its grandeur. And this photo becomes way less interesting if I crop in and put the horizon line in the center of the frame. Having the rocks take up the bottom 2/3 of the image makes it way more intriguing, and it leads your eye to the horizon in the distance. Now, in contrast to both of those examples, here's a photo I feel does not do a good job of following the rule of thirds. The bird is placed in the right third, which is great, but because it's still dead center, the image feels a bit messy. If the bird had instead been placed in the bottom right intersection, you would have been able to see way more of the ocean and the waves. So how can you start using the rule of thirds to improve your images? The simplest way is just to start placing your subjects on the lines and intersections of the thirds grid. I shoot weddings and couples, so on a wedding day, this may look like placing the groom on the right third when he's doing up his tie in the morning and looking out the window. Putting him on that right third makes the image way more dynamic than if I were to put him right in the center. Having him in the center, I end up wasting the whole right side of the image because nothing is happening over there. If I instead put him over on the right side, he can now look into the rest of the frame, which is a lot more dynamic. Or for a first look, instead of grouping the couple up in the middle of the frame, move the camera to put a little bit more space between them so that each person lands on one of the vertical lines. Now, by giving a little bit more space between the 2 subjects, I'm balancing the image and not clumping all the details into the center. And by placing the subjects on the vertical lines of the thirds grid, I'm making sure that one person isn't too far over to the side and getting lost in the edge of the frame. Even though the rule of thirds is called a rule, it's not really a rule. It's just a tool or a guideline that you can use if you choose to. It's not some strict rule that you absolutely have to follow or else you'll be a bad photographer. I break this rule all the time. In fact, I'm literally breaking it right now. The fact that I've placed myself in the center of the frame rather than on the left or the right third is breaking the rule of thirds. And if you overlay a thirds grid on me right now, you'd see that my eyes are actually above the top vertical line, which is also kind of breaking the rule. I did this because I felt like there was just too much headroom above me if I placed my eyes directly on that line. Remember that the rule of thirds isn't there to constrain you or force you to frame your shots a certain way. It's a tool to help you get better compositions quickly. So feel free to break the rule and be creative with your shots. That being said, if you are just starting out in photography, I would really recommend sticking to this rule for the time being. Practice placing your subject's faces on the top horizontal line, practice putting your subjects on the vertical lines. Learn how to construct a frame using this rule first, and then branch out after you've built yourself a solid knowledge base. You want to know how the rule works and how to implement it well before you start breaking it. If this video was helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more photography tips.